Hello, friends. Today's story begins not with a headline, not with a loud statement, and not even with a formal announcement, but with a strange atmosphere that has quietly formed around several events that, at first glance, seem unrelated. The setting is familiar. Late December, the end of the year, when people usually wait for calm, for holidays, for closure, and instead find themselves watching the news with growing attention. Near Donald Trump's estate, where a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky is expected, journalists, observers, and political analysts describe an unusual mood. Not dramatic, not tense in the classical sense, but rather suspended, as if something important is hovering in the air and everyone feels it, but no one quite names it yet. The words spoken there are careful, measured, almost overly polite. Trump says that Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine to succeed. Zelensky listens, reacts, nods, but the meaning of these phrases remains strangely blurred. They sound significant, but their true weight is not yet clear, and that is exactly what draws attention. Something is clearly being prepared, something is moving toward a delicate phase, and many sense that this phase will change more than just the tone of statements. At the same time, far from that estate, far from diplomatic halls and microphones, other signals appear. In the night between December 28th and 29th, reports emerge about a large drone incident involving a Russian state residence in the Novgorod region. Numbers circulate, then change, then are rephrased again. First one figure, then another, then explanations about interceptions and responses. Official voices speak in calm, bureaucratic language, but the very scale of the event makes people pause. 91 long-range drones, they say. Some were intercepted, then more were intercepted, and the arithmetic itself becomes a topic of discussion. It is not fear that dominates here, but confusion mixed with a sense of pattern. Observers quietly note that similar things seem to happen whenever negotiations approach a sensitive point. Just when it looks like documents might be discussed or decisions might be formalized, something unexpected appears. Something that shifts attention, something that creates a new reason to pause. And while analysts debate geopolitics, another layer of reality unfolds at street level, far from presidents and palaces. In small towns and regions across Russia, people share videos and stories that paint a very different picture of daily life. A local administration congratulates residents on a holiday, but makes several mistakes in a single short message, a symbol, perhaps small but telling. People talk about saving money on clothes, on food, on simple joys for the new year, speaking about it without anger, almost gently, as if endurance itself has become a habit, even a virtue. We will manage, they say. We have managed before. Patience is described as the country's greatest resource, more valuable than oil, gas, or gold. The words sound calm, even proud, but behind them, one can sense fatigue that has become normalized. Then there are the quiet videos from regional hospitals and clinics. Dim corridors, simple lamps, worn walls, empty rooms where there should be staff. A children's hospital in a small town, a district clinic on a holiday morning, a laboratory with no workers because there is simply no one left to work there that day. People filming these places do not shout. They do not accuse. They speak softly, almost apologetically, pointing the camera and asking simple questions. Is this how it should be? Is this normal? They compare what they see with what television says about other countries, and the contrast feels strange, as if two realities are being shown at once, and people are unsure which one they are supposed to believe. And then there are the scattered, unsettling notes that appear like footnotes to a larger story. A wanted notice for a drone operator who fled after a tragic incident. A report about someone stealing a single mandarin and sitting in a corner to eat it. Images that feel small and personal, but somehow echo the larger themes of tension, scarcity, and quiet strain. None of this yet forms a clear picture. It feels more like fragments of a mosaic that has not been assembled. Politics, diplomacy, regional life, personal stories, official statements, and unofficial videos all coexist, overlapping without fully connecting. But that is exactly what makes this moment so intriguing. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Because in the next part, we will begin to connect these fragments and reveal what stands behind this unusual convergence of events. Right now, we are only standing at the edge of the story, sensing its shape, but not yet seeing it clearly. The details are already here: the names, the places, the numbers, the voices, but the meaning is still just out of reach, waiting to be unfolded. Now the scattered pieces begin to align, and what earlier felt like separate signals turns into a single, coherent picture. The meeting around Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky was not just another diplomatic episode, but a marker of how sensitive and fragile the current phase of negotiations has become. When Trump said that Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine to succeed, that phrase was not simply a personal opinion, but a carefully chosen formulation aimed at softening the public tone, lowering expectations of confrontation, and preparing the audience for the idea that dialogue is possible. Zelensky's reaction was restrained, almost neutral, because in such moments, any visible emotion can be interpreted as either weakness or provocation. Behind these calm gestures lies a very tense process, one where every word is weighed and every pause is noticed. It is exactly at this stage that the drone incident near the Russian presidential residence in the Novgorod region appears. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Official Russian statements describe the event as a large-scale overnight attack using 91 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles. The numbers were repeated in different combinations: 18 intercepted first, then another 23, then the rest accounted for later, creating a narrative of control and effectiveness. But the political effect of this incident was far more important than the technical details. The timing of the report allowed Moscow to shift the focus away from negotiations and back to the language of threat, defense, and external pressure. Instead of talking about possible agreements, media discussion moved to air defense, security, and alleged provocations. This shift did not require dramatic speeches or declarations of emergency. It happened quietly, through the logic of news cycles, where one topic simply replaces another. This mechanism has been observed before, and many analysts describe it as a way to preserve flexibility. When negotiations approach a point where real commitments may be expected, a sudden escalation or incident creates a reason to pause, to reassess, to delay, without formally rejecting talks. It allows officials to say that they remain open to peace, but circumstances have become complicated again. In this way, responsibility is not directly refused, but gently redirected. And the narrative becomes one of constant obstacles rather than constant choices. At the same time, inside Russia, a very different but deeply connected story is unfolding. Public rhetoric continues to emphasize endurance, unity, and historical resilience. People repeat familiar phrases about difficult times and collective strength, often sincerely, often out of habit. Yet the everyday reality shown in regional videos reveals what this endurance actually looks like. It is not heroic in the cinematic sense. It is quiet, routine, and sometimes deeply sad. It is a grandmother choosing cheaper food before the new year, a family postponing buying winter clothes, a clinic corridor where the paint is old and the light is dim, but no one complains loudly because complaining itself feels unnecessary. The video from the children's hospital in Bogdanovich in Sverdlovsk Oblast is not shocking because of any single dramatic detail, but because of its ordinariness. The building is functional, the lights are on, the heating works, there is even accessibility equipment for people with disabilities. Yet it feels empty, understaffed, worn, as if time itself has passed through it too many times without leaving anything new behind. The person filming does not shout about injustice. He simply asks whether many towns in Russia look like this, and whether this is considered acceptable. The tone is calm, almost conversational, and that calmness is what makes it powerful. The same tone appears in the story of the small district clinic, where the corridors are quiet on a holiday morning. Not because everything is perfect, but because there are no doctors on duty and few patients left who expect anything different. The laboratory is empty, the rooms are simple, and the person filming, half-jokingly, wonders if one day workers will be invited from abroad because no one local remains. It is said lightly, but it touches on a serious issue: the gradual thinning of professional life in small regions, where young people leave, specialists retire, and replacements do not arrive. These scenes form the social background against which political decisions are made. When leaders talk about patience, they are not speaking into a void. They are speaking into a society that has learned to normalize difficulty, to treat scarcity as a natural condition, and to replace expectations with endurance. This is why phrases about national strength resonate even when daily life feels increasingly narrow. They offer a sense of meaning where material comfort is limited. Even the smaller, almost anecdotal stories fit into this picture. A person in the Moscow region stealing a single mandarin and eating it quietly in a corner is not just a petty incident. It becomes a symbol, however unintended, of a society where small pleasures are sometimes out of reach, and where people adjust to that without protest. A wanted notice for a drone operator who fled after a tragic event reflects the militarization of technical professions, where skills that once belonged to civilian life now carry heavy consequences. Each of these details on its own seems minor, but together they describe a system under strain, not collapsing but stretching. The political and the personal mirror each other. On the international stage, negotiations are postponed, softened, redirected. On the domestic stage, expectations are lowered, desires are simplified, and endurance is praised. Both processes reduce friction in the short term. Both avoid open confrontation, but both also prevent resolution, replacing it with a steady state of waiting. Waiting for better times, waiting for clarity, waiting for decisions that never quite arrive. This is why the current moment feels so heavy even though it is not loud. There are no dramatic declarations, no visible crises in the classical sense, no sudden shocks that force immediate change. Instead, there is a quiet accumulation of unresolved issues, layered over each other like thin sheets of ice. Diplomacy moves cautiously, society moves slowly, and the space between promise and reality becomes wider. The story, then, is not about a single meeting, a single drone incident, or a single hospital corridor. It is about how these elements interact to create a climate where uncertainty becomes normal, and where the future is always discussed, but rarely shaped. This is the essence that now stands revealed. A system that sustains itself not through resolution, but through postponement. Not through clarity, but through carefully managed ambiguity. And it is within this atmosphere that the next developments will unfold, developments that will either reinforce this pattern or finally challenge it. What follows from this is not a sudden turn, not a dramatic breakthrough, but a widening of the same landscape, where the political, the social, and the psychological continue to influence each other in subtle ways. After the initial statements and reactions, after the drone reports and the shift in focus, the international discussion slowly returns to the question that never fully disappears. What kind of future is being prepared by this constant postponement? In Washington, in Brussels, in Kyiv, and in Moscow, officials speak in cautious language about stability, predictability, and the need to avoid further complications. These words sound responsible, even wise, but they also mask a deeper uncertainty about direction. When stability becomes the main goal, change becomes something to be feared rather than something to be shaped. For Ukraine, this means living in a state of permanent expectation, where support from partners is real, but always accompanied by conditions, timelines, and careful wording. Zelensky's role in this environment is that of a constant negotiator, not only with foreign leaders, but with his own society, which is tired, strained, and yet deeply aware of what is at stake. Every visit, every speech, Every meeting carries the weight of reassurance, both to citizens and to allies. Ukraine is presented as resilient, determined, and forward-looking, and in many ways it is. But resilience itself becomes a burden when it must be demonstrated endlessly without a clear endpoint. For Russia, the emphasis on patience and endurance becomes both a narrative and a policy. The idea that people can tolerate hardship for the sake of the nation is not new, but in the current context, it takes on a renewed importance. Economic challenges, demographic changes, and the slow erosion of regional infrastructure are all framed as temporary sacrifices, necessary for a greater good that is rarely defined in concrete terms. This framing reduces the risk of open discontent, but increases the risk of quiet disengagement, where people no longer expect improvement and instead focus on survival and routine. In Europe, especially in countries like Germany, France, and Italy, the situation is watched with a mixture of concern and fatigue. The initial shock of the conflict has long passed, replaced by a more complex awareness of its long-term implications. Energy policy, defense spending, and internal political debates are now shaped by the assumption that uncertainty is not a temporary phase, but a lasting condition. Governments adjust budgets, businesses adjust strategies, and citizens adjust expectations. This adjustment is not dramatic, but it is profound, because it redefines what is considered normal. The United States plays a special role in this environment, not only as a supporter of Ukraine, but as a signaler of global priorities. Statements by figures like Donald Trump are therefore closely examined, not just for their immediate meaning, but for what they suggest about future policy. When Trump speaks of Putin wanting Ukraine to succeed, the phrase is interpreted in many ways: as a gesture of goodwill, as a tactical move, as a test of reactions. It creates space for interpretation, and that space itself becomes politically useful. It allows different audiences to hear different messages, to project their hopes or fears onto the same words. Meanwhile, the quiet stories from small towns and ordinary people continue. A teacher in a provincial city takes on extra work because her salary no longer covers basic expenses. A doctor considers leaving a regional hospital for a larger city or another country because the workload is too heavy and the resources too limited. A young family postpones having children because the future feels too uncertain. None of these decisions are made in anger. They are made calmly, rationally, as adaptations to circumstances that are no longer questioned. This adaptation is perhaps the most important development of all. Societies adapt faster than they protest. They change habits, adjust desires, and reinterpret values in ways that make difficult situations livable. Over time, what once felt unacceptable becomes ordinary, and what once felt temporary becomes permanent. This does not mean that people are happy or satisfied. It means that they have learned how to live within narrower boundaries, how to find meaning in smaller spaces, and how to avoid confronting questions that seem too large or too distant. The risk of this process is not explosion, but stagnation. A world where everyone waits, everyone adjusts, and everyone postpones is a world that moves very slowly. Innovations are delayed, reforms are softened, and bold decisions are replaced by careful management. The language of politics reflects this. Instead of transformation, there is stabilization. Instead of solutions, there are processes. Instead of goals, there are frameworks. These words are not empty, but they are gentle, and gentleness can sometimes be a way of avoiding clarity. Yet even within this gentle stagnation, change does not disappear. It moves underground, into cultural shifts, demographic trends, and personal choices. Younger generations grow up with different assumptions about security, identity, and belonging. They travel more, communicate more, compare more, and question more quietly. Their expectations are shaped not only by national narratives, but by global ones, by social media, by international education, by exposure to different ways of life. This creates a subtle tension between official stories of endurance and personal desires for openness and opportunity. In Russia, this tension appears in the contrast between patriotic language and practical decisions to emigrate, to study abroad, or to build careers outside traditional structures. In Ukraine, it appears in the desire for integration with European institutions, alongside the fatigue of constant mobilization. In Europe, it appears in the struggle to balance solidarity with domestic pressures. In the United States, it appears in debates about the extent of global responsibility versus national focus. All these tensions coexist without resolving each other. They form a complex equilibrium, stable but uneasy, calm but fragile. The world does not feel as if it is on the brink of immediate crisis, but it also does not feel as if it is moving toward clear improvement. It feels as if it is holding its breath, not in fear, but in uncertainty. And this, finally, is the expanded meaning of the story that began with a meeting, a statement, and a night of drones. It is a story about how modern conflicts are not only fought on battlefields or negotiated in conference rooms, but lived in kitchens, hospitals, schools, and quiet streets. It is about how politics shapes everyday life not through dramatic commands, but through slow shifts in expectations. It is about how people learn to live with less clarity, less certainty, and less promise, while still searching for dignity, stability, and meaning. The future remains open, but not in an optimistic sense. It is open in the sense that it is undefined, waiting to be filled by decisions that have not yet been made or by changes that have not yet been recognized. Whether this openness will lead to renewal or to deeper stagnation depends on forces that are still forming, still invisible, still quiet. For now, the world continues, gently, cautiously, patiently, carrying its unresolved questions forward.